Welcome back to the Global Goals Studio. We're talking about vulnerable populations. Eddie, I just want to bring up a tweet that you put out recently. It said, "When I say my disability hasn't held me back, that's all people seem to hear. What's not heard is what comes next, which is this. It's propelled me forward and gifted me the supreme ability to transcend the world rather than my body. It's made me the badass that I am." You have certainly defied the odds with your numerous achievements, Eddie. How are you encouraging others in the disability community, and really all communities, to transcend a world transfixed by this pandemic?
Well, I think that often when we speak about marginalized or vulnerable communities, the tendency is to pathologize these communities as though who they are and the identities that they embody, as though those things are wrong and not the world in which they live, right? So my work as an activist is really to push back against that narrative. And vulnerable communities are vulnerable because they've been made vulnerable. They've been made to disappear not just from public view, but from the discourse itself. I think a practical example is the way that we've been speaking about people with disabilities against the backdrop of COVID-19. We've not explicitly named the communities that are bearing the brunt of the pandemic. When we say people with underlying conditions, we need to name people with disabilities. We need to name the fact that Indigenous people, Black and Brown people in both the global North and the global South are disproportionately affected by the pandemic, both by the global health crisis itself, but also by the economic fallout of the crisis. So I think it's about really contextualizing this notion of vulnerability and really turning our gaze towards the systems and the institutions and the structures within which people need to navigate.
Ms. Fleming, as you know, we just discussed the vulnerable populations encompasses so many different groups: the homeless, the disabled, displaced, the sick. From your vantage point at the UN, you're able to survey all of these different vulnerable populations. Does one appear more pressing in its needs than the other? How do world leaders, how are they supposed to prioritize between them?
Well, first I just want to second what Eddie just said about it's really, people are made vulnerable, they're not born vulnerable.
Right.
And what's amazing about people who we would put in the categories of the vulnerable is they're actually just people like you and I. It's just a question of circumstance. Unlucky circumstance in the case of people, caught up in war, for example. And so I think, what is the most pressing? It's really difficult to prioritize because there are so many different areas of suffering, but people who can't feed themselves from one day to the next. They were living maybe in a job where whatever they earned that day was what they were feeding their children that night, and because of the pandemic, because a secondary, maybe unintended fallout from it was that they can no longer feed themselves. And there are people who are actually dying in COVID zones, not from COVID, but from other circumstances. So I think because this is the acute on top of the acute, I think that this is a priority right now. Let's make sure that the COVID-19 pandemic doesn't have those secondary effects that it was making vulnerable populations even more vulnerable. And at the same time, let's look at what the COVID-19 has exposed. It has exposed so much, vulnerability in the terms of poverty, in terms of, not unequal access to healthcare, to digital, to education. So let's go beyond that and work towards making this better as we go forward. We don't want to go back to where we were.
Right. Also, Ms. Fleming, you still have many people who say that as long as you have humanity, you're going to have poverty. You're going to have inequality. So how would you respond to such a cynical point of view?
That's really sad because, we actually, in 2015, when the world came together and got very enthusiastic about these 17 goals that we call the Sustainable Development Goals, you know, there was this vision and this aspiration, and I think this realization it doesn't have to be that way. We don't have to live in an unequal world. We don't have to live in an unjust world if we all pitched in together. So I think, you know, this is our aspiration as the United Nations, and we'd like to really work towards that. If we don't have a vision, if we're not optimistic, and if we don't have hope, then we're doomed.
Right? It's all about vision and optimism.
Melissa, we're going to thank you for that. We're going to take a short break. Andrew, Eddie, please stay with us, and people watching at home as well. You're watching the Global Goals Studio. We'll be right back after this break.